trouble broke out in the army between Alexander, his closest advisors, and many of the Greek soldiers who had no desire to go further than Babylon or Iraq. And he was asking them to. And so now he had to go to work and do real public relations, and he did. And there are at least half a dozen scenes in which Alexander gets up on a podium and addresses thousands of men. I don't know if he used a speaker or what, but well, I mean, allows something to amplify his voice, because the reports of these scenes are vivid. And so he would get up on the rostrum and he would talk to them, and he would talk them into it. He would talk them into it. One more, come with me, one more, and then we'll go home. Come with me just this far, and then we'll go home. And of course, the next big trip was going to be leaving Iran and going across the Oxus River, which is at the east edge, and into Afghanistan and further. That was going to be and they were definitely angry, and they didn't want to keep going. But before he confronted them with that, there was the question of Darius. Darius had gone ahead on a main road, was in a Persian city, surrounded with his bodyguards and his fellow leaders and his generals, and they were plotting against him. They were beginning to realize that the Greeks were coming after Darius, that they would never be free themselves until the Greeks got him or something happened. So they plotted the assassination of Darius. Their best friend, the friend that they'd been with for years and years and years, his own generals plotted the assassination. And so one night after dinner, with all of them around together, they arrested him. They just had soldiers walk in and arrest him, and chained him up and put him in a cart. And none of them actually wanted to be responsible for killing him. So they put him in the cart, and they just threw a spear into the cart. In other words, to kill him. But nobody was going to be the one who did it. And the cart was hitched to oxen, and they, whacked the oxen, and the cart went off. So here was the great Persian emperor dying, chained up in a cart. And the oxen wandered, this was at nighttime, and in the morning found this lake and pulled up, pulling their cart with them, pulled up and were drinking water when a Greek soldier, forward scout for Alexander, came to the lake for water. And here was this cart pulled up to the lake. So he went and pulled back the tarp, looked in, and here was the emperor, chained up and bleeding to death, with only his little dog next to him. And the soldier, we know his name. I just love this. I just think this is so great about history. Don't you love this? His name is Polystratus, Polystratus, Polystratus. So he came into the wagon, and he dried the blood on Darius's face and said, because they could speak Greek, both of them, and said, "Can I do something for you?" And Darius said, "Yes, bring me some water." So Polystratus went out to the lake and filled his helmet with water and came back and washed off Darius's face and gave him water. Imagine this scene now, the Persian emperor dying in this cart, and the only person with him is a Greek soldier who's taking care of him and bringing him water and held him, and Polystratus stayed with him and held his hand. And Darius thanked him and said that he would pray to God a thanksgiving that he did not have to die alone. And all the time his little dog sat crying next to him, and then he died in the arms of Polystratus. Polystratus immediately jumped on his horse, raced back to find Alexander, who was very, very close, and Alexander came forward with him, came to the wagon, went into the wagon, held Darius, and wept at the hideous, sad, ugly way that this great antagonist of his, had died in this cart. And then he took Darius back to Persepolis and made sure that the Greeks and the Persians arranged an appropriate royal funeral for Darius, and everyone remembered that ever after, particularly his mother, Sisigambas, who of course was with them and living. So that's that little Persian miniature there, the death of Darius, and our picture is a contemporary picture of the lake. 3:30, July 3:30. Now, of course, he had to convince his men to keep going, and they didn't want to. At this point now, the relationship between Alexander and his troops is quite filled with tension, and again, he has to convince them to come with him. Here they're crossing a river into Afghanistan, way up there in the heights, and then they entered up into Samarkand. If you look on a map, you can find it. It's right on the edge of what were the great Silk Road caravans that went east and west from Mongolia all the way to Europe. And so it had a legendary wealth that derived from being this position on the Silk Road. And in Samarkand, which was a kingdom, he met the king and met the king's daughter, Roxanne, fell in love with her and married her. And so this becomes the future of his dynasty, the possibility that she would have a child. She did become pregnant, and she is with him when he dies, but the anti-Alexandrian party murders her immediately and the little baby, so there would not be any Alexandrian successor. But in the period here then in Samarkand, she goes with him, and they continue now south into that's the marriage, into India. So they're coming down through Afghanistan, and that's a map of what they thought the world looked like. In other words, they didn't know anything beyond the edges of India. This was a map of the present time. And so down, now they're coming down out of the mountains, down, and into the Indus River Valley, dropping out of Afghanistan. And then they had to start fighting again because there were great kingdoms in India, in the Ganges River Valley, and now his own troops rebelled and said, take us home. Take us home. We're going with or without you. Take us home. And he said, okay, we'll go home. And they thought that meant they were going to go back. And he said, we'll go down the river and come around the bottom of Arabia and come up. And of course they objected, but he said, oh, well, this is way better. This is a way better route. We'll just go down the river and come around. It wasn't a way better route. It was going to turn out to be a terrible route. And during the voyage through the Indus River Valley, he was wounded badly. This is a scene from the wounding when they were trying to take a fortified city, and the men went up toward the wall, and they were giving up, and they were dropping back on their ladders, and he realized that if somebody didn't do something, they were going to lose. So he went up on a ladder by himself, the first person up the ladder, and he was shot with an arrow. It went right through his upper body, all the way through. And so, of course, the men had to run and get him. They, of course, were driven by this to take the city, so they took the city. But now he had a terrible recovery of many weeks. And at one point, the only way he could keep his army together was to have his men mount him on a sailboat and have him visible, and then sail up and down the shore so that his thousands of troops could see him and wave at him, and then he was waving the one hand that he could move, but he was in desperate condition. I don't think he ever recovered from that wound. He had different attacks later that sounded a lot like pulmonary filling up and not breathing right, and I think probably he was badly hurt by that injury and never got better. In any case, he led the men through the Indus River Valley and all the way around what is a great desert at the south end of Arabia. It's Yemen, and it's a terrible, difficult trek because there's no water. And so he was leading this multi-thousand-sized army through a desert. Even though they took water with them, it didn't last. And so they were, many men died in this trek through this desert, Marrakesh Desert in the south of Arabia. Arrived back in Iraq, Babylon, greatly harmed and ill. The men were sick. He was sick. Hephaestion was sick, both of them. And now back in Babylon, they were facing a terrible period. Essentially, he saw it as failure. He felt that in India he had failed. And both he and Hephaestion were ill. And then suddenly his very best friend died in Babylon, and he was devastated. He was just completely he felt responsible. He felt that it was his leadership that had killed men on the road, and so with the death of Hephaestion, he declined. There's lots of writing about him drinking. It's possible that he was drinking too heavily. There's lots of books written saying he was an alcoholic. In any case, with the death of Hephaestion, his leadership declined. The faith that people had in his leadership declined. And by early 323, their position in Babylon was weakening. And then in June, he got sick. The description of his illness could be malaria. It certainly had to sound like that, raging high temperatures. But it also could have been poison. And many, many historians think that both he and Hephaestion were poisoned, that the plotters against him knew they had to kill both of those men. They couldn't leave either one of them alive. And so first they eliminated Hephaestion by poison and then eliminated Alexander by poison. So that's certainly one possibility. And on the 10th of June, Alexander died in Babylon. The aftermath is almost as extraordinary as all the rest of it, because Ptolemy, his very best friend, the Greek family, the Ptolemies, took him to Alexander. He wanted him to be buried in his city, that's named for him, and so he had this extraordinary cart drawn by 50 or 60 horses across the deserts, all the way from what would be present-day Iraq through Israel and through Gaza and to Alexandria. And so this meant that the procession, which involved thousands and thousands of people, and enormous treasure to build the tomb, which was on wheels. He was inside there. And of course, thousands and thousands and thousands of people came from all over the Middle East to be on the road so they could say, years and years later, I was there the day they took Alexander to his tomb. And so this procession continued for a year. It took a whole year to get from Iraq to Alexandria, because it was moving so slowly, and they had to create the road in many places. They had to lay down road, and so they would be moving just a very few miles every day. And all of it was, of course, orchestrated by Ptolemy, a lifelong friend he'd grown up with, and with the goal of bringing him home to Alexandria and creating an Alexandrian memorial in his city, which is what he did. He brought him back to Alexandria, and in Alexandria they built the great tomb. This is another picture, a drawing of the journey of bringing that enormous funeral cart back to Alexandria and burying him. And of course, that tomb lasted for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Many, many famous people went to that tomb, including Julius Caesar, and stood and wept at the tomb of Alexander. And only later in the Islamic conquest was it destroyed. So it endured almost 1,000 years after his death in 323. So that's our story, Alexander the Great. I don't know if you'll agree with me that he was great, but if you realize that Aristotle and Plato is handed to future generations all because of the availability of Greek for millions of people, and that great language is there because of Alexander, that alone is something that changed the world.